In this video, we'll look at this year's common question for UWEC-BC. This year's common question asks, what is the power of a story? To approach this question, consider that stories are in everything we do and say. Stories are a part of our identity, how we think of ourselves and our society. They are in places you might not even realize. Memory is a type of story, where you emphasize certain details and leave others out. History, mythology, religion, and dreams have stories. There are even stories in math and science. In this video, we'll look at the power of stories in art. What type of stories can be found in art? Stories about culture, stories about characters, and stories about the history of art itself. To approach these questions, we'll look at one painting in particular, an experiment on a bird in the air pump. In the National Gallery in London, England, hangs one of the most famous paintings of the 18th century. The painting is by Joseph Wright, who lived in the village of Derby in the English Midlands, and his painting is called An Experiment on a Bird in the Air Pump. This painting represents the ebb and flow of cultural cross-currents flowing into each other in England during the 1700s. At the time this painting was composed, the Industrial Revolution was just beginning. This revolution brought with it a focus on the mechanization of the economy, and that focus meant that people, objects, and ideas took on different meanings and symbolic references. What was perhaps a religious symbol might now assume commercial or scientific meaning. For instance, a bird or an empty jar, both of which had religious or philosophical meaning before, now also had scientific or commercial value. The 18th century was also the time of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment emphasized scientific advancement, secularization, and an emphasis on human rights in a social contract defined by liberty and consent of the governed. While these scientific and economic changes were happening, the 18th century was also a time of significant religious change. Between the beginning of this century and its end, there was increasing secularization throughout England. Penelope J. Corfield observes that the emergence and proliferation of professional classes, such as doctors, lawyers, nurses, and scientists, provided lay people with different avenues to find answers and seek help in time of need. As she writes, quote, "People might thus shift their hopes from spiritual to medical salvation. The same money which 300 years ago was given for the health of the soul is now given for the health of the body." End quote. In other words, the clergy no longer occupied the same preeminent role in people's lives that they did in prior generations. Lay people sought answers, comfort, and relief from different authorities, including lawyers, scientists, and medical doctors. These different historical trajectories, the Industrial Revolution, the Enlightenment, and ever-shifting religious beliefs, collided together in people's everyday lives. This collision meant that people saw their lives through an ideological prism that split objects, concepts, and events into different lights. Those lights included the spiritual, commercial, mechanical, and scientific. It is with this prism that Joseph Wright of Derby depicts a scene of science, spectacle, and horror in the painting An Experiment on a Bird in the Air Pump. Take a minute and look at this painting. Study it with your eyes. What do you see? Where do your eyes start? How do they track over the image? What are, in your opinion, the most important parts of this image? In the center of the image is a scientist performing an experiment concerning pneumatics, which is the study of the flow of air. He has an air pump with which he can create a vacuum, sucking the air out. However, to give the demonstration some drama, he includes a cockatoo. At our moment of seeing, the air has been removed from the glass orb, and the bird is moments away from dying. To the left of the scientist are two lovers, who aren't the least interested in the experiment. Also to the left is a young boy fascinated with the drama of the experiment, and a young man studying the moment, trying to discern, perhaps the science and mechanics of the trick. In the darkness to the right is an older man, lost in thought. What is he thinking? He seems to be focused on some larger issue or issues concerning this experiment. The majority of the candlelight is focused on three figures, presumably two sisters and a father. Both girls are clearly disturbed by the experiment. The younger looks on at horror and the other looks away. Why does she look away? The father figure focuses on the older girl and points at the device. Is he pointing at the bird to say something like, "There, the bird will survive"? Or does he point at the experiment as a whole, as if to explain the experiment? To the far right is a young boy who is retrieving the bird's cage, which implies that the bird may survive. To return to the scientist, he looks directly at us, as if we're part of the image. Why? Are we part of the scene? Does he look at us with accusation, with instruction? Of all the different attitudes in this painting, which one does Joseph Wright, the painter, consider most important? Or are they all important in their own ways? So what do we make of this painting, and what does it have to do with stories? Well, this painting tells many stories. Stories about the figures in the painting, stories about the history of painting, and stories about the cultural cross-currents that the people of 18th century England were located at. Let's start with the characters in the painting. Each of them represents a different way to respond to the bird in the painting. The lovers couldn't be less interested. The boy to the right is dutifully doing his job while still wanting to watch the demonstration. The older man, shrouded in darkness, seems to be contemplating the larger philosophical issues at play, perhaps the ethics of sacrificing a bird for an experiment that is much entertainment as it is education. The father figure and the two girls are a story unto themselves. Is he instructing them and admonishing them for being worried about the bird instead of learning from the scientific experiment? Is he assuaging their fears, letting them know that the bird will survive? Or is he consoling them that the bird's death is for the greater good? Brian J. Wolfe asks why the father is seemingly more focused on the older girl and ignoring the younger one. The young boy on the left is looking with salacious delight, and the young man next to him concentrates with studious attention on the experiment. And then there's the scientist in the middle. Is he an educator, an entertainer? Will he let the bird live or die? Why is he looking at us? And does his depiction harken back to religious paintings? Each of these figures is a story unto themselves. This apparent connection to religious depictions that I just alluded to takes us to another story involved in this painting, the story of artistic movements and their evolution. Could the scientist allude to paintings of the lives of the saints, such as this depiction of St. Peter in the Dream of Pope Innocent III? Notice how both St. Peter in this painting and the scientist face the audience, with light surrounding their face. Both have outstretched arms. Was Joseph Wright drawing on religious imagery to make a point about the role of the scientist in his society? The gaze of the scientist could also point to another painting called Las Meninas from 1656. Marguerite Helmers, in a rhetorical analysis of Wright's painting, compares these two works of art. Notice how the painter in Las Meninas, to the left, stares at us. Is he looking in a mirror, or is he looking at us? Let's look at some of the other connections between this painting and history and religious symbolism. Laura Bordeaux, in her scholarly article, An Air of History, Joseph Wright's and Robert Boyle's Air Pump Narratives, describes some of the intersections between this painting and religious iconography in art. For instance, the scientist is not the only object in the image that can be interpreted differently based on artistic history. Another such example is the bird, a cockatoo, in the air pump. In terms of the bird, Bordeaux writes, quote, "Inside Wright's air pump, the white cockatoo is both an experimental object dying from want of air and an image of the Holy Spirit, a religious symbol of inspiration. In keeping these two very different identities of the bird in suspension, Wright captures a cultural moment poised somewhat uneasily between Christian interpretations of the world and Enlightenment science." End quote. Bordeaux's point is that the dual symbolism of the bird represents different ways of seeing the world, whether those be religious, scientific, capitalistic, or patriarchal. These different symbols tell different stories about artistic depictions and how they evolve, stories about symbols and how they change, and stories about historical movements and how they progress. Wright's home of Derby was an industrial town, and he would have encountered people from different walks of life: industrial workers, landed gentry, and farm workers. He lived at a moment of significant transition. It was a time when England was sorting out religious and secular culture. It was a time when science was both a serious endeavor and a venue for popular entertainment. Perhaps some of this rings true because it echoes our own era. All of these ideas emerge from an experiment on a bird in the air pump, because Wright's painting isn't just an image, it's a story of a moment in time when different viewpoints were converging.